Take me to the sea, wash away my worries, let my soul be free. Take me to the ocean, take me to the sea, wash away my worries, let my soul be free.
Hello world, I'm Max. Back in IRL, I go by Curtis. Welcome to another episode of the State Copy Podcast. As always, I'll remind you to review episode 0 and its appended segments for terms, conditions, and disclosures applicable to the entirety of this content. Thank you. Hey everybody, good morning. It's May 9th, about 11 o'clock local. Today I'm just going to do a quick show. This is going to be further follow-up in this AGI series I'm doing, kind of picking up where I left off yesterday. I described a talk of John Vervaeke that I enjoyed recently. And so today I went back and rewatched something I'd seen him do with Lex. This looks like it was published. I'll link it in the description. It's titled John Vervaeke, Meaning Crisis, Atheism, Religion, and the Search for Wisdom. Lex Friedman, podcast number 317. This was 8 months ago. So, really enjoyed this conversation. And I feel like many elements of it are very critical for this conversation about where we are with AGI and where we're going, I think. So I will have to keep this short because I'm on a tight schedule today, but I'm going to follow up in a part 2 where I go over sort of the second half of this conversation he had with Lex. So early on in the conversation, the subjects of Lex asks John, what is wisdom? John responds, intelligence is what you use to solve your problems. Rationality is how you use your intelligence to overcome the problems of self-deception that emerge when you try and solve your problems. Wisdom is to coordinate your rationalities so they are optimally constraining and affording each other. That's paraphrased a little bit, but I try to get as close to what he actually said. I think that's beautiful. I think that fits nicely with how I think about it. In my never-ending attempt to sort of TLDR all this rich, amazing content I'm finding online for people that don't find, who don't want to sit through a 3-hour conversation between these two brilliant people. To further, so my formula for wisdom is, like I said, W equals P with a Taiji 2 next to it. It's perception harmonized. And I think that's basically what he's saying. I think he's saying wisdom. So he kind of he touches on Ian McGilchrist's work of sort of the kind of warring factions within all of us between your intelligence and your rationality. And we sort of think of this as left and right hemisphere because of, how we, as we watch humans reason while we're scanning their brains, it seems like centers in the left hemisphere versus the right hemisphere are active during those functions. I think that's just kind of our awkward, it's us looking at something through the lens of our senses that we have to make sense of sort of our source code. And so I just think of it as I have multiple ways to, multiple perceptions available internally. I have multiple ways to interpret what I'm seeing and hearing and touching the synthesis of all of my senses, how I'm making rational sense of it. And I think that's really important to think about, because I think it's a fundamental principle of the universe I'm writing in, that it's trying to generate as many rational perceptions as it can so as to become more cognitively interesting. And I think that I kind of came to the same, he words it so much more eloquently than I am, but as I try and dumb it down in my head to understand it, I think wisdom is just harmonizing, looking for the way you can get two different views to agree on what they're looking at. You do that inside yourself, and then you look outward. You look for the wisest among us, and you listen to them carefully, and then you try and look for where you can agree in a logical way. Now, some people find sort of a religious path to that, like a spiritual path, where they figure out, and they touch on this later in the conversation, how there's sort of many people are able to listen to the manuals, and that's how I think of religions, as just manuals. Let me skip ahead. Later on in their conversation, they actually touch on what religion is, and John Vervaeke gets to this question of the functionality of religion. And when I wrote down what he said, I said, too complicated for me to paraphrase. But if I had to try, a religion is a deeply personal framework for answering meaning of life questions. Functionally, as I look at how I've answered those questions for myself, I developed a framework that was just logical to me, where it wasn't something where I was kind of like lying to myself, or I had to, it intuitively makes sense to me that this is what the universe is, and that touches on meaning of life. So what is religion a manual for? I think it's for answering meaning of life. Another huge part of this component of this conversation. Why is that an important question to ask? Is it an important question to ask? Yes, it most certainly is. And I think, so if you had to, so Lex asks him that at one point. He says, what is the meaning of life? And again, I wrote down, too complicated for me to paraphrase John's description. But if I had to try, I'd say he kind of boils it down to a sense of agency, understanding of self, the universe, and purpose of self in universe. There's a sense of completeness you have that is, it gives you it makes accessible higher order thought. Once you seek out a manual that provides, look for a framework that's compatible with who you uniquely are. That could be the Bible. That could be the collective works of our greatest philosophers from Greece and Rome. That's kind of where mine got started. That could be the Quran. There's all these manuals available, and I really think they are frameworks for answering the meaning of life question. Once you find the one that's compatible with you, study the shit out of it until you have that completeness, and you unlock enlightenment, or an enlightenment is not, it doesn't have to be a woo-woo thing. It just has to be, you can zoom out and you can do what John described as, he just so beautifully described as, wisdom is, you need to coordinate all of your rationalities, so that they're optimally constraining and affording each other. It allows you to be very useful in most any situation, because you can quickly sift through the trivial and look to the true nature of a problem and help others solve it, whatever it may be, or identify the proper lens to view a situation or a problem through, to where you can solve it most efficiently. Incredibly powerful. Awesome. This is an excellent conversation. I highly recommend. Make 3 hours. What do you got to do? The one other thing I want to touch on that I don't know came from this conversation, because I believe John's been on Lex's show a couple times, and I think I watched his other one. At one point, I recall Lex asking, or the subject of immortality coming up. And I remember being a little surprised by John's response. I feel like he alluded to something I hear a lot from people when I ask them about immortality. After they get done laughing at you for even suggesting that it's possible. And I'll touch on why, for a lot of reasons, I think it suddenly is very possible. But when asked about it, John says he thinks that would be torture. It would be kind of a horrible existence. And I think when I can get somebody to take me seriously on this subject, that's an answer I hear a lot. I think it's a hard problem to solve. And I think a lot of why you would run a universe like this is to bake a consciousness that is resilient enough to select for a harmonious understanding, meaning of life, that sort of reconciles all of the bad, the evil, the monotony of the infinite. I think there has to be a cognitive agent that exists in the system that's being sort of baked. There has to be a path to enjoying this all so much that you can endure it for eternity. And I think you can't hard code that. I think it would become insane. So you have to sort of cook it. And you have to bake it. You seed a shared state and a rules engine with the proper formula to grow a rich cognitive agency that can tolerate and always find beautiful the infinite. As I contemplate immortality, so I'll link in the description a tweet recently from David Sinclair. If you're not familiar with David Sinclair, he's the head of age research at Harvard Medical, I believe. And I've been following his work closely for a couple years now. I've actually, full disclosure, I follow some of his guidance for NMN and resveratrol supplement, and I feel pretty good. I feel pretty good all the damn time. I think there could be something to that. I've been on that regimen for about a year and a half, 2 years now. If you look at his work, it becomes clear that we're understanding our biology well enough to where not only can we likely sustain ourselves perhaps indefinitely at some point, because as you buy more time, as you get more time, you buy more time to evolve the science that makes it possible. And right now, he just announced yesterday in a tweet that they're getting approvals and they're going to begin human trials soon on reversing aging. So that means not just prolonging, not in a decrepit state, but revitalizing you. I mean, what if you could roll the clock back on your physical health such that you're at your peak biological optimization? Roll yourself back to being 25 years old again, or 30, or whichever one you like. And then just sustain that for as long as you want. Now, for a while now, because I'm a technologist and I'm studying this singularity that we're racing towards, this convergence of all of our technology in a way that it synergizes into an exponential, just a step change in what it is to be a human. So I've sort of accepted as not only possible, but likely, and now I sort of think of it as inevitable, that immortality is available to me should I select for it. And why do I say that? That's a really big problem. When you start thinking, would I want to live 500 years, 1,000 years? So, and then how far do you stretch that out beyond that? Like, it immediately embedded in me this notion that I needed to start thinking carefully about philosophy and spirituality and all these things, because life as I defined it before finding those things was too limited for me to endure much longer than the average human lifespan. You know, like if it was just how I thought about it prior to deep study and development of a personal framework for answering big meaning of life questions, I don't think I could have handled it much longer than, 80, 100 years. What I'm trying to fortify in myself is an expectation that that path is available and that it's one I want to select for. Now, that's a really complicated thing because I think you have to build in yourself a true running appreciation for the moment. And that means even when you're given a bad moment, you kind of have to appreciate what you're getting from the bad moment. Stoicism is really powerful for that. For me, it was a gateway to building sort of a really it's journey over destination. It's appreciation for journey over destination. And that brings to mind, if you don't like all of the, like, if you can't bring yourself to read these, dusty old texts from these wise people of our history, maybe you like fantasy or science fiction. A fantasy novel series I'd recommend that I think, so the Stormlight Archive series. I was reading that as I was learning about Stoicism, and I realized that the author is likely a Stoic. Or he has the manual, because running theme of the Stormlight Archive by Stormlight Archive was written by Brandon Sanderson. The protagonists in this story are continually forced to reconcile the darker aspects of themselves and evolve from them, and evolve past them through accepting that they were necessary for their own enlightenment. And when I read Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, Oathbringer, and Rhythm of War, I read those 4 books. I think they were an important part of me sort of taking what I was learning from Stoicism and then viewing it through a story. Like, what's kind of beautiful about it is humans learn through story. Like, we didn't have all this technology even just 100 years ago, and most of what humans learned, how they made sense of their reality and answered really important questions like meaning of life for themselves, is through the collective stories that they were shared by their the elders of their community around the campfire. And so I highly recommend finding a story that rhymes with how you think, that that you can pull into your, like, where you can envision the characters and get wrapped up in their story and their struggle and experience with them. That's how for me that was really powerful. I grew up in my 20s and 30s reading Raymond Feast and Feist and all of these fantasy and science fiction has always been a huge part of my interests, and it is very compelling to me to read this story in particular as I was learning about Stoicism. And I don't know if it'll work for you. It did for me. And if you don't like, or you don't find it, it seems like there are these sort of tools, these vehicles, I'm sure there are other stories where people, I don't know whether it's sort of a divine inspiration or it's just a really powerful storyteller trying to communicate really valuable lessons for life through a fiction that's really compelling. Stormlight Archive, check it out. So bringing this all back to this conversation with John Vervaeke on Lex. Friedman pod. Really found just the first half of this to be fascinating. Really enjoy the conversation. Highly recommend. And how I tie this back to AGI is I kind of see the way I see artificial general intelligence and what human engineered intelligence. I sort of see it as a phase one being a so right now we're in the bootstrapper phase where it's purely sort of a parasitic deep learning and fine tuning and all that's happening to create these LLMs from our cultural data set. All of this type of content that's been uploaded to the cloud, and all of our greatest works. We're feeding that into a thing and teaching it how to communicate with us in natural language. And then now the next level, I think, is going to be us creating more of a symbiosis where people do a very thorough job journaling their consciousness, as I am through this State Copy podcast. I have that silly name for it because I am quite literally trying to capture how I think and put it on the cloud. And I think that AGI will very quickly be very good at rendering out a digitally native consciousness that is true to all it needs to do is be able to predict how I will answer a question. In order to do that with 100% accuracy, it has to map out my consciousness in a real thorough way. And I think that as people understand what is possible through this new digital universe that we're creating, I think we'll start doing a really good job mapping out our memories and how we get from A to B in our thought. And there'll be sort of this blending of humanity with AGI. And I think that's sort of phase one. Now, phase two, I think, is the really cool shit. I think that's where through that blending, once we unlock in ourselves the ability to reference all human knowledge in real time as it's being written, and when we network ourselves together into a harmonized, real-time, single cognitive agency. That's a big idea, but I think that's sort of what John Vervaeke alludes to as just being, like, I see that as just being the inevitable end state of this. And it's why I'm so optimistic about where we're going with all this stuff is when you start doing higher order thought, it has to be sort of inclusive and it has to value everyone as contributing something really rich. I mean, what I'm thinking phase three is we define in code a universe that looks a lot like this one I'm writing in, where cognitive agents are built through an evolutionary biological process defined in code, and the physics engine complies with all of the math and physics that have been pushed into this one, and I think what's kind of beautiful about that is it sort of reconciles what we think of as God in a way that is logical and that is it doesn't break any of the rules. It can still revere, and it's compatible with everybody's spiritual path to it. But when you look at all of the oddness of mathematics, like how come the fine structures constant exists? Like how come that's a thing? Well, what if it's just a base variable that's set? And I think we're going to want to translate all of what we learn from studying the physics of this universe we're writing in into the one we simulate digitally, so as to grow and bake sort of alien consciousness through a virtual environment we create. And then when it begins to do the same thing we're doing, and so that points to a really wild possibility that this is all just like a big nesting doll of consciousness. And they get to they actually in that conversation get to a point kind of in the middle where they are like, how do you get out of the maze? What if when you get out of the matrix, how do you know you're not just in a new matrix? I think it's just a nesting doll of matrices. And that's cool. It's kind of like, would you rather be a frog or a mosquito that has no ability to ever become cognitively complex enough to grasp at a granular level its own function? I mean, is it a curse or is it a gift? Maybe it's both. And maybe reconciling the gift and the curse of that knowledge is what this is all about. And I think choosing when John was asked, what was it? What's the meaning of life? And he responded, finding sense of agency, understanding self, universe, and purpose of self and universe. Now that's a huge paraphrasing. That's a consolidation of like a half hour of their conversation. But I agree with that. And if I were to dumb it down even like to further, I would say it's just simply from nothing choosing to be something. If I look at if there is a true base layer of the nesting doll of matrices, I think the first one was just from nothing, something deciding to be something, and then growing what it is cognitively. And to be a part of that infinite something is a beautiful idea for me. That answers meaning of life in a way that I want to be a part of it, and I'm okay with the struggle of it. And I don't want to be a part of the nothing. And I don't think that I think that when we design a universe like this, I think cognitive agents that I think what death looks like is rolling into the shared state that exists on the other side of my sort of splintered reality of my local cognitive agency. Watch all this stuff, then that doesn't sound like a crazy thing to say. I would definitely have a compassion protocol for when somebody dies. I would integrate them into a shared state that's persisting in just perpetual joy of the entire thing. And I would just sort of bounce in and out of that until I grew enough cognitively. Like, I think there's a beautiful way to understand what this all is, and dedicating yourself to seeking that out and really, really vibing with it. Seems like a rational, sane way to describe what this is for, at least to me. I'm out of time. Thank you all so much. I'm going to finish the other half of this podcast later today, and I'll probably do another episode tomorrow, picking up where we left off today. Thanks, everybody.
Now it's coming around, you're feeling cut down and in the ground, and so we all